As Scott said, I'm going to talk about a lot of the factors going on in these markets, and hopefully there's not too much duplication on what Frank and Randy talked about yesterday, but I'm presuming they're going to be covering more of the corn, soybeans, and some of the other crops. So to get started, just to kind of a little background on the Dakota Wheat Commission, we do have 7 board members. 6 of them are elected from people like yourselves at county meetings, county elections, and then we do have one that's appointed by the governor. And primarily, looking to expand market opportunities for North Dakota wheat. Recently, we've been investing a lot in research, trying to drive up profitability in wheat. We know we're got a lot of competition out there, from canola to the pulse crops to soybeans to dry corn, and so wheat needs to remain competitive for you. And then recently addressing the transportation and international trade issues. Budget is about $5 million, and we can see the bulk of it is in research and then international marketing. And if you, I know you just got done listening on some farm bill type discussion. We do fund North Dakota grain growers, U.S. germ growers who work on farm bill and farm policy. So wheat market factors. And I apologize if I go a little bit fast here, but I tend to probably put in more slides than I need, but there will be some picture ones, so hopefully if we get lost, we can kind of just look at the pictures. But so the big thing, and I know this is a broken record, and everybody's tired of hearing about it, but just record Russian wheat exports. And I'll show some charts here later. It's just incredible how much they've been able to expand their production and take over world wheat trade, whether that was Putin's plan or just, they've had great weather, good timing that way and big crops. But the other factor that's somewhat interesting is, Russia has increased its bombing of Ukrainian cities and ports, but the market seems fatigued. A year ago, we used to kind of get a bump or a rallying market. I think even late last year, there was some expectations that that's where we're going to get our rallying prices from. Is Russia's not going to let Ukraine export, but like I said, the market is fatigued on it right now, and it doesn't really seem to get a response. World supply and demand is in balance right now. We are tightening our stocks, which is certainly positive long term, but as of right now, there's not a lot of panic buying in the world market. Obviously, one area to keep an eye on is the Middle East conflicts, especially that Red Sea corridor. There's a lot of big wheat consumption markets in the Middle East. And now that Iranian warships have kind of moved in there, there's a lot of big wheat buyers that are now taking it out of the Mediterranean all the way around to Africa, coming up around. So that could certainly shift some trade patterns if that continues. The U.S. winter wheat crop right now is probably a price negative factor in the market. They went into winter in a lot better shape than a year ago. I would say the biggest risk, as it is with us living up here, is we had such a nice December, but we don't have our thick skin on like we typically do this time of the year, and so you get these cold air shots coming. There's certainly some wheat that could be vulnerable to that because they have very little snow cover. But right now, the market is not concerned about the winter wheat crop, and if anything, it's probably a little bit price negative factor. And then U.S. export base, and obviously that's a big area we work in. It's been a struggle the last couple of years, and I'll show some price charts, but essentially we are the highest price wheat in the world market, and that's good for us that we can get a premium. But when you got world economies that are struggling, I mean, we all know our own household budgets. Everything's got in price. And worldwide, I mean, the U.S. is actually doing better than a lot of the world economies. So as prices get tight, the cheapest price wheat tends to win out. So obviously, the last couple of years, just a lot of Russian wheat exports. If we look at Russia's the blue, Ukraine's the orange. You can see just the last 4 or 5 years, Russia's really ramped up world wheat trade. Just as little as 5 years ago, they used to be 15 to 20% of world wheat trade. Right now, they're pushing the level of over 30%. Probably a third of world wheat exports that come out of those two countries. Right now, Russia is winning the battle, and part of it's they've had record crops, but they're on pace for record wheat exports this year. The EU is also doing a lot of exports, and part of that is in the Ukraine, when Odessa and a lot of their other ports are getting bombed. A lot of that's coming by land in Eastern Europe. So it's as it would here, it's ticking off the Polish farmers, a lot of Eastern European farmers, and so they're trying to stop the flow of Ukrainian wheat coming into Europe. But then what happens is European wheat to get forced out in the world market at cheap prices. So it's really distorted things. Canada, due to relatively good crops and the cheaper Canadian dollar, has had some good export years. The U.S. is down slightly. I think we're going to end the year better than this, maybe equal last year. Australia had a drought this year, and it's just El Nino, La Nina effect. Last year was a good crop, this year not so much. And then you can see in Ukraine, they're really being hampered in their wheat exports. And I don't know if you can see these prices. They're from early November, but it's all still relative. But you can see Russian wheat down to about $230 a metric ton. That's for 12.5% protein wheat. Whereas you look at our spring wheats, we're at 310 to 315. That amounts to about $2.50 a bushel cheaper. So quite a price gap. And especially when you look at hardwood winter, due to some drought, other issues, that's really where we're struggling. Fortunately, Russian wheat prices have improved for the month of December and January. As you well know, our prices have come down a little bit, so we're narrowing that gap, which I think will help us going forward. So obviously in the U.S., what we've seen is, we're not as competitive in the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, Europe, just because of all that Russian Black Sea wheat. But what we are seeing gains is in Latin America, Asia, and on one hand, that's good because they're willing to pay the higher price for our higher quality wheats. Obviously, there's less competition from, the dirt cheap Russian wheat and sources. So going forward, I was visiting with someone this morning, and like I said, if we look at stocks of wheat, we're not where we were 6 years ago. So why are prices in the tank and really struggling? Well, there's a lot of factors, but I think, looking long term, this is a positive to look at. As world wheat inventories are coming down. You can see China holds the bulk of the world wheat stocks. The major exporters, which are the U.S., Canada, EU, Australia, Argentina, we're not really building inventories. Black Sea is going to be pretty tight. So, and I know it's kind of cliche, but, we are still just one crop away. 1 year away from, if there's a pretty big crop wreck in a big producing country, prices will respond. Stocks are tight, but just in the short term here, things are certainly in balance. So if we look at the U.S. wheat crop in 2023, then obviously this is all old news now. But we did have drought in the hardwood winter region, but yields came in better than expected. Montana had a really good crop. Softwood winter, which is growing in the Corn Belt, had a really good year. So that's why they're getting a lot of the sales to China. They've got some more competitive prices. The spring wheat region, and you know this very well, we were marginal for moisture, and ironically, the eastern areas were somewhat drier than our western areas. But still, yields came in better than expected. Domestic demand, we are seeing a little bit higher feed use. In some of the hardwood winter wheat areas, they are seeing more feed use of wheat and also softwood winter for the chicken feeders. And we've got stable U.S. food use. Exports, we'll talk about this a bit later, but it's primarily hardwood winter that's really struggling in exports. The other classes are better. And if you want to gauge your marketing, this is what USDA is saying. For this year, all classes of wheat, all proteins, all qualities, 730 a bushel. So if you sold your wheat higher than that, above average. But still, the reality is, wheat is going to struggle. I mean, right now it's struggling profitability wise, and certainly when you compare it to a year ago, down almost $1.50 price. So hardwood winter is typically the largest class produced in the U.S., but you can see the 2 years of drought, what that's really done. Really hammered their availability, and as a result, relative to the normal price in the market, they are higher because of these tighter supplies, and that's also hurt the demand. Spring wheat, we've had 2 better than expected crops after the 21 drought. So our supplies are a bit more stable, and then you can see softwood winter saw an increase this year. If you look at U.S. wheat food use, this is another positive going forward. We all remember the Atkins diet, the anti-gluten trends. Well, those certainly have turned here in the last few years. This is kind of the height of the Atkins diet, what it was doing for wheat consumption. I think Fran might have been on the Wheat Commission at that time, where we invested a lot more money into trying to combat a lot of those false diet claims. And then the Wheat Builder book came out. But since then, we reached record levels last year. So people are eating more wheat products, bread products, pasta would be included here. This year it dipped a little bit. But part of that may just be that mills are getting a better extraction out of the wheat, better test weights, et cetera. So they don't need to use many bushels. We really don't have a declining trend in consumption, so to say. If you look at exports by class, the hardwood spring wheat growth here is the leading class being exported from the U.S. Typically, it's hardwood winter. And then you can see softwood winter with a lot of sales to China. Is there any durum producers in the room? Or, really? Is there potential durum producers next year? Okay. So my 30 durum slides, I probably should skip them. But you can see on durum, we're actually, it's a small level, but we're doing about 40% better in exports than a year ago. So, and I know in most of your marketing clubs, most of you look at numbers, it's the ending stocks that a lot of people look at, stocks to use ratio. And I find this somewhat interesting, but it shows that, hardwood winter is kind of in a quandary right now, that they've had lower production, which should spark much higher prices. But because they've struggled on the demand side, they're actually starting to build some inventory. And certainly in spring wheat we are too, but not compared to where a couple of years ago, and even with pretty good crops. And it's because we've had good domestic demand as well as improving export. But at the end of the day, it's the price that pays the bills, and as of right now, wheat, we're not as low as we were in 2020, but I've seen some market analysts that still feel prices have drift a little bit lower, just because of market world fundamentals. But I think we are, at least on spring wheat, appears at the $7 seems to kind of want to set a floor, but nonetheless, certainly well below a year ago. But spring wheat is starting to gap a little bit of premium to the other classes. So on hardwood spring wheat, and this is just kind of a summary for the crop for the year. We had a pretty high grading crop. Yields came in better than expected. Probably our biggest challenge is vitreous kernel levels. And I don't know if you guys seen that so much here in your crop, but the color of the crop just wasn't there. We had a lot of trees, whether it was the Canadian wildfire smoke. But in the Pacific Northwest, we do have some customers like Thailand that specify 75% vitreous kernels. And so in Montana this year, there was actually premiums and discounts to producers on color. But that was kind of probably a big shortfall, in addition to pockets of low protein. We are more competitive on exports this year. The railroads did do some adjustments in rates. A year ago, probably as much as 30 cents a bushel or more, we were at a disadvantage to Canadian exports out of Vancouver. So we lost a lot of sales in South Asia, Japan. But the railroads did make some adjustments. And so now if you look at current prices at Portland and Vancouver, Canada, we're actually a few cents cheaper. So that's helping us recapture some demand in South Asia. Domestic demand, we are down a little bit this year just because the hardwood winter wheat crop was higher protein. And as I showed on the stocks, we are up slightly, but still at historically tight levels. So if we look at yields, U.S. yields for the region were more stable this year. North Dakota came down a little bit. And that's simply because Montana had a pretty good recovery. Most of you would call 30 bushel a pretty poor crop. But compared to where they were the last couple of years, they did have a pretty good bounce in yields. And actually Minnesota, I'm talking to a lot of Minnesota growers, in July, they thought they had a disaster. Because it was hot temperature, there was no rain. But at the end of the day, they actually out-yielded last year. So our production, we're still below our 5 and 10 year averages, but it is up slightly. Protein, because I know that's always an important factor too, is potential protein premiums. The overall regional crop is lower this year. It's somewhat of an anomaly. The eastern crop is higher protein than the western crop. And so, this fall, when we were visiting the customers, the Great Lakes actually had very little protein premium, whereas the Pacific Northwest had more of a protein premium. And it's because some of this harvest in this part of the region was shipped to the P&W in September, and they were stuck with a lot of 11 and 12 protein wheat, and there's nobody on the P&W that buys that. So we are starting to get some protein premiums come in, but like I said, due to your drier conditions, the eastern part of the region is really where the protein is this year. So hardwood spring wheat, we have seen increasing trend in domestic meal use of spring wheat. This year, the black bar were down a little bit, and simply because hardwood winter is being used, but a lot more refrigerated dough products, frozen wheat products are conducive to spring wheat, as well as what they call clean label. So when you buy a package of something, all those long words on the package are typically enzymes, preservatives, shelf stabilizers, trying to improve taste and texture. But a lot of consumers want a clean label, so they just want wheat or wheat flour, and spring wheat is what they have to do. So that's helping us bit there. As far as export base, and again, I'm trying to bring out some of the positives in the market and maybe something that will give us traction in pricing going forward. But in most of our major markets, we are running ahead on sales as of mid-December, which is halfway through the year. Taiwan, Japan, Korea, where we're struggling is Thailand. And as I said, they do have a higher vitreous specification. And then China, we're hoping to capture spring wheat in China. But if we focus on Mexico, one thing to keep in mind going forward is Mexico has become an important market, and we rail about 8% of our exports directly to Mexico. And in December, the Customs and Border Patrol put an embargo on all rail crossings going into Mexico. And there was some, chicken and cattle feeders in Mexico that were pretty close to having to shut down because they couldn't get corn. But we also have a lot of wheat that is railed into Mexico. And the primary reason is just, there's a lot of immigrants who will ride the train and walk up across the border. And so they're having to try to control that somewhat. And so the easiest way that we would just shut down the border. And so as that happens, you may see that trickle back up here to some local bases or some rail shipments getting delayed. But hopefully they can kind of keep that flowing. So at the end of the day, hardwood spring wheat stocks, we're going to be up a little bit this year, but it's still relatively tight. So as we get the glut of Russian wheat off the world market, there's some weather scares. In Europe, the market isn't overly abundant in wheat for it. You can't really. It's just right now, it's, like I said, there's really been no panic buying in the build market. So there's no durum producers in the room. Okay, maybe I've got a couple slides. Well, I mean more than a couple, but I'll just pick out the highlights. So, have any of you followed, the price spread between durum and spring wheat here this last year? So durum prices right now, granted it's out in the northwest part of the state, but they're around $9 a bushel. You need top end quality, high food price. You guys want the game, try to sell out there. Weather impacted durum, but so that's close to $9, whereas 14 Pro Springs are about $6. So there's a lot of market advisors and even seed dealers saying, obviously durum acres look to be higher in that part of the state. And maybe in this part of the state, it might be an option too, if you've got the right crop rotation and really good with fungicides, managing disease issues. So with world durum, we had our smallest crop in 30 years. World durum production. And a lot of that was driven by North Africa, which is a key consumption producing area. We had a major drought. Canada's crop was down due to a drought. And then in Europe too, they've also had some adverse weather, and they're certainly well below the 5-6 years ago. So world durum is almost a 180 soft foods. Supplies are pretty tight. So we look at potential exports this year. You can see the U.S. is higher, EU lower, and in Canada it's down just due to smaller crop. But the big thing that happened with durum is prices get close to $11. Some producers were able to sell for that, but Turkey and Russia dumped a lot of durum into Europe in August, September, which really crashed prices. And then Mexico's also exported more. So prices that, I kind of took the wind out of sails a little bit. But, going forward, Europe is going to need to import more this year. Strong North African demand. And so if we look at world ending inventories of durum, again, they're at very tight level. I apologize, this is a million tons, but this is essentially about 15 million bushels of durum. Come June of this year, will be on hand in Europe, the US, and Canada. So less than 50 million bushels if the projections are right. So it's going to be a tight situation. US durum, our acres really haven't changed much the last few years. Us in Montana grow about pretty similar levels of acreage. So on domestic food use, we're still seeing pretty good, domestic demand for pasta. So this is our projected inventories of durum in the US. So June of this year, a little over 15 million bushels, which will be our tightest since 07 and 08. Granted, prices don't respond like they used to some of those stocks. I think buyers have gotten more comfortable with the tighter situation. But obviously, so the big question is, will Canada grow? And, they've been holding at about 6 million acres the last few years, but there's no doubt they're going to grow more doing it. But just like canola, pulses, a lot of those crops are offering some pretty good returns as well. And then the spring wheat hasn't been too bad, but there's no question they'll be up a little bit. And part of it is, they've had some tough production years. So this is the ending inventories in Canada, and they're certainly in a very tight slide for durum stuff. So these are my slides. Okay, I'll just do 20 local. Andrew, I'll give you time. So what's going to happen in 2024 acres? And I'm sure you had a lot of discussion yesterday with Randy and Frame. Obviously, a lot of opinions on it. So nationally, if you look at corn acres last year, they were a record high, almost 95 million, up 6 million. Soybeans down 2 million. So nationally, the market intelligence is soybeans are going to be obviously higher, corn will come down. For wheat, we were up 4 million acres. The early thoughts on arguably the winter wheat is acres are going to be higher. They just had a better fall season. Spring wheat, I guess you tell me. I know a lot of you are going back and forth on cropping plans, visiting with some producers here. There's no question current prices don't spell profitability or strong incentive to put in wheat. But there's probably going to be other factors that I think may help hold acres steady or even drive it higher in some parts of the region. Obviously, the first is the lack of multi-party contracts. And, that was a big competitor last year. I think the forecast for the early planting season tends to lead to more wheat acres, especially in the western part of the state. And then high production costs of corn. Now, wheat is not a cheap crop either compared to soybeans. But I think as margins are going to be tight this year, it's kind of where crops stack in terms of the production costs. But for durum, yeah, certainly we're expecting an increase in durum acres just due right. So that's national wheat acres. This is the current price difference between durum and spring wheat. So I guess you tell me in Dakota, we've been down, the last 3-4 years, but I think we will see higher durum acres. Probably having more winter wheat acres than in spring wheat's kind of the big wild card. With that, we got time for one question.